Hello again, everybody. You know, if I wanted to lose about half of you, or you would just turn this channel off right now, all I would have to do is mention that this week's episode is about bonds.
That's it. I'm out of here.
No, don't go anywhere, Homer. I promise, we're not talking about fixed income today, all right? Unfortunately, we're talking about something that some of you might find even more insufferable, I'm sorry to say. Yes, we're talking about the exciting world of the U.S. dollar.
No, God!
Yes, we're going to talk about currencies and the dollar, but I promise I'm going to spice it up a little bit and only talk about the relevant things that help us all as investors. And I hope by the end of this episode in a few minutes, that you'll all have a little bit better understanding about what the dollar really means to you, the recent strength. But most importantly, you'll learn that all of the conspiracy talk about the downward fall of the dollar, if not the complete elimination, is hogwash. So stay with me on that. But for right now, let's take a step back and put all of this in context a little bit. First of all, currencies are a strange thing. They're an asset class unto themselves, really. Think about it this way. You have a stock portfolio, and on a really good day, almost all of your stocks, maybe on a really, really good day, all of your stocks will rise in unison. Same thing on a down day, of course. Most of your stocks will be down. That's not how the world of currencies work. If somebody says to you, hey, did you see the dollar was up today? Your answer should be, relative to what? Because all currencies around the world cannot all move up and down in unison. So if somebody says the dollar is up, what they might be meaning is, well, versus the Japanese yen, which means, obviously, the yen was down today, but only against the dollar. The yen might have actually been up that day against the euro. See, that's as deep as I'm going here today. I'm not going to bore you. We're not going to get overly complicated. There are a lot of reasons why a country's currency is really, really strong. We're not going to get into a lot of them right now, but I am going to get into something that's very, very important. One particular issue, why the dollar is so strong. But before we get there, let's take a look at the chart. And this shows you now the dollar versus a basket of currencies going back we're going back to about 05 or so here. So a good long 20-year chart of how the dollar has been behaving versus a basket of currencies, okay? Now, on the left side, kind of that first third of the chart, yes, you've got your ups and downs, but overall, not much movement in a big way. That all changed about a dozen years ago. You can see that big jump there at about January of 15, still incrementally going higher from there, then another big jump. In other words, about the last dozen years or so, the dollar has continued to move higher versus a bunch of currencies of developed countries that we put in a basket and create its own index. Now, why is that? Why has the dollar been so strong in recent years? In fact, over the past dozen years or so. Well, you can look at things like interest rates and inflation differentials and trade deficits and all that stuff. Again, I promised, we're not going to bore anyone. We're not going to make anyone go away here. So I'm not going to dig deep into the weeds here, except for this one item. This is very subjective, but I think it's the most important thing when it comes to determining whether a currency is going to be strong or weak. And it's all about political and economic stability. No country in the world does it any better than the United States of America, and it's been that way for a long time. And especially since the so-called Great Recession happened more than 15 years ago, and even more especially since we had the COVID economic lockdown. Now, some of you skeptics out there, you cynics, and I can be one of them, will say, Dave, did you just talk about economic and political stability, and you said America does it better? Have you not seen the news in the last number of years? I get it, but again, remember, it's all on a relative basis. No country in isolation. Newsflash, there has never been a perfect country. There never will be. But when we compare countries one to another, the United States of America is still at the top of the of the class when it comes to all developed countries. You just have to look at the way that capital flows in and out of countries. We continue to get more foreign capital. Let me tell you something. They may not say this publicly, but even our adversaries need and want a stable dollar. They need and want a strong America because they are so tied into our economy. So all this talk about there's going to be the demise of the dollar and the dollar's going to go away and the Chinese yuan is going to take a... Can we stop with the silliness right now? There's the first conspiracy that I want to absolutely destroy. When somebody tells you, well, you know, the dollar, it might be the world's reserve currency now, but it's going to go away. You'd say, okay. What's going to replace it? Because you have to have the other part of that equation. What other currency is then going to be the world's reserve currency? The Chinese yuan? Are you serious? That's laughable. I'll show you a chart in just a second that shows you that they're not even anywhere near ready for prime time at this point. No, there is no other currency at this point that is stronger or more in need when it comes to global trade. Here's another chart. Let me prove this point to you. This will show you the amount of dollars in vaults, if you will, at central banks around the world. And as you can see, that's our red line. That's American dollars held by central banks on God's green earth. And yes, you can say, well, you know, back in 2000, we were a little bit more than 70% of all the reserves held in vaults around the world, and now we're only at about 60. Yeah, that's true, but most of that decline happened in the 2000s. We've been about 60% of all currency reserves since about 2010. So the blue line, take a look at that. That's the euro. Has that taken away any of our percentage? No, it's basically the same place as it was back in 2000. Oh, what's that other blue line, the darker blue line? Non-traditional. Well, I will tell you, part of that is the Chinese yuan and some smaller currencies. But still, it barely registers. Let me tell you what's really non-traditional there that's represented, and it's this chart. That, my friends, are gold reserves held in central bank vaults around the world. It is not a coincidence. That big spike that we see from around the Great Recession time, around 2005, 6, 7, around there, the big spike in gold reserves happened as the dollar was starting to strengthen. It's no coincidence. Let me explain the connection here. You are a central bank chairman, if you will. Here, we call it the Fed chairman, but you're in another country and you hold a lot of different currencies. Every country does that. You have some yen, you have some euro, you have the British pound, you have whatever, the Canadian dollar, you have the US dollar. Now, typically the US dollar is your largest holding. Well, as it goes up in value, it's a larger percentage of what your country is holding. You properly diversify, like you as individuals. Aren't you properly diversified? You should be. And if one position, because it's doing so well, becomes a larger percentage of your overall portfolio, you should be taking a little off the top and redeploying it to other things. That's prudent financial planning. Central government Fed chairman types do the same thing. So as they look at their balance sheet and they see, wow, we have too many dollars now in terms of value, we need to diversify. Are they taking that, selling dollars and buying more British pound? Not really. Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan? No. Maybe in small increments. No. What has been known for thousands of years is kind of the safest thing to own just as defense when it comes to lots of currency fluctuations and political and economic instability. It's gold. So let me show you that chart one more time on gold. That's what you're seeing here. We're not up to the levels that we had in the 60s. And by the way, in case you're wondering, wow, what's that big drop there that occurred in the early 70s? You may recall, if you've been around for a while, that's when President Nixon took us off the gold reserve, and so you had that big drop, and then it stabilized. You really started going down in the 90s, and then that big spike up again. So please, folks, do not believe the fear-mongering out there that, hey, have you heard all the central banks are increasing their positions in gold? That must mean they see something. It's been going on for a couple of decades. 15 years at least. And it's because they are properly diversifying. Oh, do you think the dollar is going to lose its value and the Chinese yuan is going to? Are you kidding me? Political and economic instability? Look, let the Chinese and the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Russians, if they want to come up with their own economic cabal and trade in the Chinese yuan, let them. The rest of the world knows where the stability of the world is, and it resides in the U.S. dollar and in the United States of America. Oh, by the way, here's another one. I'm pulling all my cash out of the bank. Really? Why would you do that? You haven't heard? Government doesn't want us to have cash anymore. They're going to replace it by the digital dollar. And so I have taken my cash out and I have put it in a safe downstairs. Like, oh my gosh. Okay. Newsflash. How many of you use a credit card? Most everybody? Debit card? Have a smartphone? I hear this all the time. They want a digital dollar because the government can track us. They can find out what we're buying. They can find out what we're up to. They already do. Hello? Have you been living in a cave for a number of years? I'm not trying to offend anybody. But folks, if the government really wants to know what you're up to, they've had access to it for years. They can look at what you're spending credit card. They can look at anything that you're already taking out of your bank. They can track where you are with your smartphone. Hey, by the way, for safety purposes, there are cameras everywhere on practically every building in every city in America. Unless you're living off the grid in Montana and you don't use any credit cards, you don't get online, you're not even watching this podcast then. So it's kind of a moot point. If you're watching it, the government already knows what's up. I'm not saying that that's good. I'm not in favor of it necessarily, but that's the reality. So stop with this that the government wants to track you. That horse left the barn a long, long time ago. Let me tell you something. The government doesn't even want to get into the game of digital currency. They've got fiat currency already, the greenback that is the best, the most powerful in the world. They use it as a cudgel for good or bad. To get involved in some kind of global digital currency, the government, the U.S. government, does not want to get involved. They're only being dragged into it now, kicking and screaming because of this thing called cryptocurrency and the Bitcoin, kind of its own little quasi-digital form of currency. So the government says, they tried to ignore it for a while, didn't they? But now they realize it's become such a huge industry that they're starting to look at ways, well, how can we maybe get a piece of that? But that's so far down the road. So folks, please do not believe all this conspiracy stuff. The dollar, yes, I believe it might actually be a little overvalued now. So we might update this many months from now or a year and say, oh, the dollar's declined. It should. And that would actually help the U.S.-based multinationals because right now it's very, very difficult to do business overseas with such a strong dollar. A weaker dollar would help. But we are still going to remain the reserve currency of the world. I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now. I won't be here in 50 years, all right? I'm telling you here and now, and for the foreseeable future, and dare I say even the rest of my life, even if I live to be 100, the U.S. dollar in the United States of America is still going to remain very strong and number one. For decade after decade after decade, people have bet against the United States of America. They have bet against our freedom. They have bet against our liberty. They've bet against our economy and our financial markets. And that includes Americans themselves, who are always looking for the demise of one of those factors. And now because of social media, we're fed this garbage all the time. How these things are going to happen, how these adversaries are going to eat our lunch, how this currency is going to take us down, how the government... Stop it. People have lost money or they've left money on the table betting against this country. It's happening today, and it's always going to happen in the future. Look, there are more important things to worry about, and that's your own portfolio and how it's behaving in all the financial markets, and is it meeting your long-term goals and objectives? One of the most important things you can do, I talked about recently in a podcast, and it's all about applying a stress test. Some of you may be saying, Dave, you look a little stressed right now talking about the dollar. Yeah, I got ramped up a little bit, all right? I'm an even keel guy, but some of this conspiracy stuff drives me crazy because people lose money all the time over it. But anyway, apply the stress test. If you want to know what that actually means, please go back and look at it. In the meantime, thank you folks so much for subscribing to this channel. I've had a blast in the new studio and coming to you with various topics of financial, economic, and investment information. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am recording it, and feel free to send this on to friends and family who you think could benefit from it. We'll talk to you again next week.